Rosalind Hale needed the money more than she needed a good night of sleep, and that was the only reason she said yes when the staffing agency called about a one-night catering job at a private estate 3 hours outside the city. The pay offered was absurd for a single night of work, more than she made in 2 months at her regular serving job, and the agency coordinator assured her the client was simply eccentric and preferred privacy, nothing more unusual than that. Rose had learned over the years not to ask too many questions about wealthy clients and their strange requests, since the money always seemed to correlate directly with how odd the job turned out to be. She packed her black uniform, a pair of comfortable shoes, and enough determination to get through a long night of carrying trays and refilling glasses for people who would likely never remember her face. The address led her along a winding mountain road that grew narrower and more overgrown the farther she drove, until finally the headlights of her car caught the outline of a castle rising from the trees, ancient stone walls and towers silhouetted against a moonless sky. She parked in a gravel lot already filled with expensive, unfamiliar vehicles, some bearing license plates from countries she did not recognize, and sat for a moment staring up at the structure before her, wondering what kind of client hosted a private event at an actual castle in the middle of nowhere. She told herself it did not matter. She needed the money, and she intended to earn it quietly, efficiently, and without asking a single unnecessary question. Rose gathered her bag and walked toward the castle's massive front entrance, where a woman in an elegant black dress stood waiting beneath a stone archway carved with symbols Rose did not recognize, worn smooth by centuries of weather. The woman introduced herself only as Madame Content, the estate's head of staff, and looked Rose over with an appraising, almost clinical gaze before nodding and gesturing for her to follow inside. The interior of the castle proved even more impressive than its exterior suggested, vast hallways lined with tapestries and oil paintings, chandeliers hanging from ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow, and an air of old, careful wealth that made Rose feel distinctly out of place in her simple black uniform. Madame Content led her through a labyrinth of corridors toward the kitchen, briefing her along the way on the evening's expectations: silver trays only, gloves worn at all times, and under no circumstances was staff permitted beyond the ballroom's threshold without explicit instruction. Rose nodded along, taking mental notes, though something about the rigid specificity of the rules struck her as unusual even by the standards of wealthy clients she had served in the past. In the kitchen, she found nearly a dozen other temporary staff members already gathered, all dressed identically, all wearing the same slightly nervous expressions that Rose recognized from her own reflection in a nearby mirror. A young man named Theo, who introduced himself while helping her find an apron, mentioned quietly that this was his third time working an event at the castle, and that the pay was always excellent, though he admitted, in a lowered voice, that something about the place always left him feeling unsettled long after each shift ended. Rose asked Theo what exactly unsettled him about the castle, curious despite her earlier resolution not to ask unnecessary questions. He hesitated before answering, glancing around the kitchen as though checking for eavesdroppers, then explained that the guests at these particular events never seemed to eat or drink very much despite the enormous quantities of food always prepared, and that staff members who worked here regularly had a tendency to simply stop showing up after a few events without any clear explanation. Rose felt a small prickle of unease at this, though she reminded herself that wealthy clients often had strange habits, and that staffing agencies routinely lost workers to better-paying opportunities elsewhere without any dramatic explanation required. Madame Content returned to the kitchen shortly afterward, clapping her hands sharply to gather everyone's attention, and began assigning specific duties for the evening. Rose was assigned to the main ballroom, tasked with circulating among the guests offering champagne and light hors d'oeuvres, a role Theo quietly told her was actually considered one of the more desirable assignments since it kept her visible and therefore, in his words, accounted for throughout the night. Rose did not fully understand what he meant by that phrase, and before she could ask him to clarify, Madame Content called the group to attention once more, instructing them to finish their preparations quickly since the first guests were expected to arrive within the hour. Rose busied herself with her assigned tray and uniform adjustments, pushing aside the growing unease Theo's comments had stirred within her, telling herself firmly that she simply needed to get through the night and collect her generous payment at its conclusion. As the appointed hour approached, Rose took her position near the entrance to the grand ballroom, tray balanced carefully in her hands, watching as the first guests began arriving through the castle's main doors. They were, without exception, strikingly beautiful and impeccably dressed, moving with a fluid grace that struck Rose as slightly unnatural, though she could not immediately articulate why the observation troubled her. She offered champagne to each arriving guest as instructed, and most accepted the glasses with polite, distant smiles, though she noticed that several guests simply held their drinks without ever actually bringing them to their lips. The ballroom itself had been transformed into something breathtaking, enormous candelabras casting warm, flickering light across polished marble floors, an orchestra of string musicians playing in one corner, and long tables laden with elaborate dishes that Rose recognized as some of the most expensive delicacies she had ever seen prepared for a single event. She noticed, as the evening progressed, that despite the impressive spread, very few guests actually touched the food, and those who did seemed to do so almost performatively, taking small bites before setting their plates aside entirely. Rose continued her rounds mechanically, offering trays and refilling glasses, trying not to dwell too long on the strange behavior surrounding her. At one point, passing near a group of guests speaking quietly near the tall windows, she caught a fragment of conversation in a language she did not recognize, low and guttural, and one of the speakers turned toward her with eyes that seemed to catch the candlelight in a way no human eyes should, reflecting it back with a faint, unsettling golden glow before he turned away again just as quickly. Rose continued working through the growing crowd, her unease deepening with each passing hour despite her best efforts to focus solely on her assigned duties. She noticed more small details that troubled her, a woman in an elegant red gown whose fingernails seemed unusually long and sharpened to precise points, a man standing near the fireplace whose shadow, cast by the flickering candlelight, appeared to move independently of his actual physical posture, and a tall, gaunt figure standing motionless near the far corner of the room who seemed to be watching the other guests with an intensity that made Rose's skin crawl every time her gaze happened to pass near him. She tried to dismiss these observations as tricks of candlelight and her own exhausted imagination, reminding herself that wealthy eccentrics often cultivated deliberately unusual appearances and mannerisms as a form of social display. Still, she found herself gravitating toward Theo whenever her rounds brought them near each other, seeking some small measure of reassurance in his familiar, ordinary presence amid the growing strangeness surrounding them. During one brief exchange near the kitchen doors, Theo admitted quietly that he had noticed similar oddities during his previous shifts at the castle, though he had always managed to convince himself afterward that exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings were simply playing tricks on his perception. Rose wanted desperately to believe the same explanation applied to her own growing sense of dread, but as the night wore on and the ballroom filled further with guests whose behavior grew increasingly difficult to explain through ordinary means, she found that comforting rationalization becoming harder and harder to sustain with any real conviction. Around midnight, Madame Content gathered the staff briefly in a side corridor to deliver additional instructions for the remainder of the evening, informing them that the main course would soon be served and that all staff should remain strictly within their assigned areas until the meal concluded. She emphasized this particular instruction with unusual intensity, her eyes moving deliberately across each staff member's face as though gauging their understanding and compliance. Rose noticed that several of the other temporary workers exchanged uneasy glances during this briefing, suggesting she was not alone in finding the instructions and their delivery increasingly unsettling. Once the briefing concluded, Rose returned to the ballroom to find that the atmosphere had shifted noticeably during her brief absence, the orchestra now playing a slower, more somber melody, and the guests arranged in a loose circle around the room center, where a large covered platter had been positioned on an ornate stand. Rose felt a growing sense of dread as she watched two staff members she did not recognize wheel the platter toward the assembled guests, and something about the reverent silence that fell over the crowd as they approached struck her as deeply wrong, entirely unlike the polite, distracted attention the guests had shown toward the earlier courses served throughout the evening. She glanced toward Theo, who had positioned himself near the opposite side of the room, and saw her own growing unease mirrored clearly in his expression as they both watched the covered platter draw closer to its final destination at the center of the assembled crowd. The cover was lifted from the platter with a flourish, and Rose's stomach lurched violently at what lay revealed beneath it, though her mind initially refused to process the sight fully, some protective instinct throwing up a wall against immediate comprehension. It took several long, horrifying seconds before the reality settled over her completely, and she realized she was looking at the remains of a person, presented with the same careful, artistic garnish typically reserved for an elaborate roast, the assembled guests leaning forward with open, hungry anticipation entirely unlike anything she had witnessed from ordinary dinner guests throughout her years of catering work. A collective sound rose from the crowd, something between a sigh and a low, satisfied growl, and Rose felt her legs threaten to give out beneath her as the full horror of her situation finally crystallized in her mind. She stumbled backward against a nearby column, her tray slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers and shattering loudly against the marble floor, the sound cutting sharply through the eerie silence that had otherwise settled over the room. Every head turned toward her simultaneously, dozens of eyes reflecting candlelight in ways no ordinary human eyes should, and Rose understood, with a sudden and complete clarity that left her breathless with terror, that she had unwittingly wandered into something far more dangerous than any strange, wealthy dinner party. Madame Content appeared at her side almost instantly, gripping her arm with surprising strength, and hissed quietly that Rose needed to return to the kitchen immediately, though the warning came far too late to undo the attention her shattered tray had already drawn from every predatory gaze now fixed intently upon her. Rose allowed Madame Content to pull her toward the kitchen, her mind reeling with shock and terror, unable to fully process what she had just witnessed. Once inside the relative safety of the kitchen, Madame Content released her arm and turned to face her with an expression that carried, for the first time since Rose had arrived, something approaching genuine concern rather than cold professional detachment. She explained, in hurried, hushed tones, that the guests attending tonight's event were not ordinary people, that the castle had served as neutral ground for gatherings of this particular kind for centuries, and that staff members who witnessed the ritual meal directly were, under normal circumstances, never permitted to survive the knowledge they had gained. Rose felt her blood run cold at this explanation, understanding with growing horror that Madame Content was essentially telling her she had already been marked for death simply by witnessing what had occurred in the ballroom. She asked, her voice trembling badly, whether there was any way to avoid whatever fate Madame Content's grim explanation implied. Madame Content hesitated, glancing nervously toward the kitchen door as distant sounds of movement and low, guttural conversation began drifting through from the ballroom beyond, before finally admitting that the castle's ancient protocols technically allowed any witness the chance to survive until dawn if they could successfully evade capture throughout the remainder of the night, a tradition apparently maintained more as a form of entertainment for the assembled guests than out of any genuine mercy toward the unfortunate individuals forced to participate. Rose stared at her in horrified disbelief, understanding with sickening clarity that she had just become, however unwillingly, the entertainment for a room full of monsters hungry for exactly the kind of desperate chase that was about to begin. Madame Content explained quickly that the castle's rules, ancient and rigidly enforced despite their apparent cruelty, granted any witness a head start before the assembled guests were permitted to begin their pursuit, and that surviving until sunrise, however unlikely, would technically guarantee safe passage away from the castle grounds entirely. Rose asked desperately how long a head start she might expect. Madame Content glanced again toward the door, her expression tightening with what Rose recognized, with a distant and bitter clarity, as genuine pity rather than mere professional concern, and admitted that the tradition typically allowed only a few minutes before the hunt formally began. Rose felt panic clawing at her chest, her mind racing through every possible option available to her within such an impossibly short window of time. Madame Content pressed a small, old-fashioned key into her palm, explaining hurriedly that it opened a service door leading to the castle's eastern wing, a section rarely used by the current occupants and containing several older passages that might offer at least some tactical advantage during the pursuit ahead. She warned Rose firmly against attempting to leave through the castle's main entrance, explaining that the grounds themselves were patrolled and that her only realistic chance of survival lay in navigating the structure's older, less familiar sections rather than attempting a direct escape into the surrounding forest. Rose clutched the key tightly, her hands shaking uncontrollably, and asked one final question: whether Madame Content herself faced any danger for having provided this assistance. Madame Content's expression grew distant and resigned as she replied only that some risks were worth taking, before ushering Rose firmly toward a hidden service exit at the rear of the kitchen, the sound of the ballroom's low, hungry murmur growing steadily louder behind them. Rose burst through the service exit into a narrow, dimly lit corridor, her heart pounding violently as she fumbled to relock the door behind her with the key Madame Content had provided. The corridor stretched away into darkness in both directions, lined with faded tapestries and dust-covered furniture that suggested this section of the castle had indeed fallen out of regular use many years earlier. She forced herself to think clearly despite the overwhelming terror threatening to paralyze her, recalling Madame Content's brief mention of older passages that might offer some tactical advantage, though she had no map or clear sense of the castle's layout to guide her search. She chose a direction at random and began moving quickly but carefully, straining her ears for any sound of pursuit while trying to memorize her route in case she needed to retrace her steps later. The corridor eventually opened into a large, disused library, shelves lined with ancient, leather-bound volumes covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust, moonlight filtering weakly through tall, grime-streaked windows along one wall. Rose paused here briefly, searching desperately for any other exit or hiding place that might buy her additional time, when a sound from somewhere behind her, a low, guttural growl entirely unlike anything human, sent fresh terror surging through her exhausted body. She spun around just in time to see a shape moving through the library's far doorway, low and powerful, covered in coarse dark fur, its eyes glowing with the same unnatural golden light she had noticed earlier among the ballroom's assembled guests, and Rose understood immediately that her allotted head start had already run out. Rose bolted deeper into the library without conscious thought, scrambling between towering shelves as the creature behind her let out another low, hungry growl, its heavy footfalls echoing against the ancient stone floor as it began its pursuit in earnest. She could hear its breathing now, ragged and eager, gaining ground with terrifying speed despite her own desperate efforts to weave unpredictably between obstacles in an attempt to slow its advance. She spotted a narrow gap between two heavy bookshelves and squeezed through it just as the creature's claws raked across the wood only inches behind her, splintering the shelf's edge and sending a cascade of ancient books tumbling to the floor in her wake. Rose emerged on the library's far side and spotted a small door partially hidden behind a moth-eaten curtain, and she threw herself toward it, wrenching it open just as the creature crashed through the gap she had squeezed through moments earlier, apparently no longer concerned with the narrow space now that its prey had come fully into view. She slammed the door behind her and found herself in a narrow spiral staircase descending into darkness, and she took the stairs two at a time despite the very real risk of a fall, understanding instinctively that stopping now meant certain death. Behind her, the door splintered inward with a single powerful blow, and Rose heard the creature's claws scrabbling against the stone steps as it began its descent after her, its low, hungry growl now accompanied by something that almost resembled a laugh, a sound of predatory satisfaction that sent fresh waves of horror coursing through Rose's already terrified body as she continued her desperate flight into the unknown darkness below. The staircase finally opened into a low, vaulted chamber that appeared to be some kind of ancient wine cellar, rows of dusty bottles lining stone alcoves along every wall, illuminated faintly by the moonlight filtering through a single narrow window set high near the ceiling. Rose sprinted across the chamber, searching desperately for another exit as the creature's heavy footfalls continued closing the distance behind her. She spotted a low archway on the far side of the cellar and dove through it just as the creature emerged fully into the wine cellar behind her, giving her the first clear, unobstructed view of its complete form, a massive wolf-like creature standing upright on powerful hind legs, its body covered in matted, coarse fur, its jaw distended into a muzzle lined with teeth far too numerous and sharp for any natural animal. The sight sent a fresh jolt of primal terror through Rose's exhausted body, and she pushed herself onward with renewed desperation, sprinting through the archway into another darkened passage beyond. She could hear the creature's claws scraping against the stone floor of the wine cellar behind her, its pursuit slowed only slightly by the confined space and scattered bottles that had apparently proven a minor obstacle to its otherwise relentless advance. Rose's lungs burned with every breath, her legs threatening to give out entirely beneath the strain of her desperate flight, but the image of what had been presented on that ceremonial platter in the ballroom above drove her forward with a strength she had not known she possessed, understanding with absolute clarity that stopping now, even for a single moment of rest, would result in an identical, horrifying fate. The passage beyond the wine cellar led Rose into a wider corridor lined with suits of ancient armor standing sentinel in shadowed alcoves, their hollow visors seeming to watch her desperate flight with silent, unmoving judgment. She risked a glance backward and saw the werewolf creature emerging from the archway behind her, moving with a loping, powerful gait that closed the distance between them with terrifying efficiency despite her own frantic pace. Rose spotted a heavy wooden door at the corridor's far end and threw her weight against it, relief flooding through her when it swung open easily to reveal a small courtyard bathed in pale moonlight, open to the night sky above. She sprinted across the courtyard's uneven cobblestones, her only thought focused entirely on putting as much distance as possible between herself and the creature pursuing her, when a sound from somewhere above made her look up in sudden, fresh terror. A pale, impossibly thin figure crouched atop the courtyard's surrounding wall, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its elongated mouth stretched into what could only be described as a predatory grin far too wide for its narrow face. Rose recognized, with a sickening lurch of recognition, the description Theo had once mentioned in passing during an earlier, more innocent conversation about old regional folklore, a creature known locally as a rake, said to stalk lonely travelers along forest roads late at night. Before she could process this new horror fully, the creature dropped from the wall with unnerving silence, landing directly in her path and cutting off her only visible route of escape from the courtyard entirely. Rose skidded to a desperate halt as the rake-like creature straightened to its full, unnaturally tall height, its dark, sunken eyes fixing on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl even amid the overwhelming terror already coursing through her exhausted body. Behind her, she could hear the werewolf's heavy footfalls approaching the courtyard entrance, leaving her trapped between two equally horrifying predators with no clear path of escape remaining. The rake tilted its head at an unnatural angle, studying her with what almost resembled curiosity, and took a slow, deliberate step forward, its impossibly long fingers flexing at its sides. Rose's mind raced through every option available to her, finding none that offered any genuine hope of survival, until her eyes landed on a narrow drainage grate set into the courtyard's cobblestones only a few feet to her left. She made her decision in a fraction of a second, diving toward the grate and wrenching it open with strength born entirely of desperation, ignoring the sharp pain as jagged metal edges tore at her palms. The rake lunged toward her just as she dropped through the opening, its elongated fingers grazing her shoulder with a burning, searing pain that told her exactly how narrowly she had escaped its grasp. She fell several feet into a narrow, foul-smelling drainage tunnel, landing hard against the stone floor below, pain radiating through her twisted ankle as she scrambled immediately to her feet, aware that both creatures now knew exactly where she had disappeared to and would likely follow within moments through whatever access points the ancient drainage system might provide them. Rose forced herself to move despite the throbbing pain in her ankle, limping quickly through the narrow, water-slicked drainage tunnel as the sounds of both creatures scrabbling at the grate above her echoed ominously through the confined space. The tunnel branched twice within the first few minutes of her desperate flight, and she chose each direction based on nothing more than blind instinct and a desperate hope that any path leading generally downward and away from the castle's central structure might eventually bring her closer to some form of genuine escape. The darkness within the tunnel proved nearly absolute, forcing her to navigate largely by touch, her injured hands trailing along the cold, slime-covered stone walls as she pressed forward as quickly as her injured ankle allowed. Behind her, she heard a heavy splash followed by an angry, frustrated snarl, confirming that at least one of her pursuers had indeed managed to force its way into the tunnel system behind her. She pressed onward with renewed urgency, ignoring the pain screaming through her injured ankle with every hurried step, until the tunnel finally opened into a slightly wider chamber where a thin shaft of moonlight filtered down from some opening far above, illuminating a rusted iron ladder bolted into the chamber's curved wall. Rose grabbed the ladder immediately, testing its stability before beginning a hurried climb upward, praying desperately that whatever lay above offered better prospects for genuine escape than the confined, inescapable tunnel system she was currently attempting to flee, while behind and below her, the sounds of pursuit continued growing steadily louder and more insistent with every passing, terror-filled second. The ladder led Rose up into what appeared to be an abandoned section of the castle's stables, moonlight streaming through gaps in a partially collapsed roof, illuminating empty stalls thick with decades of undisturbed dust and cobwebs. She pulled herself over the ladder's final rung and collapsed briefly onto the straw-covered floor, gasping for breath, her injured ankle throbbing with every heartbeat. She allowed herself only a few precious seconds of rest before forcing herself upright again, aware that her pursuers would not be far behind given how quickly they had tracked her movements through the drainage system below. She limped through the stables, searching for any exit that might lead her safely away from the castle's immediate grounds, and found a large, partially rotted door at the structure's far end, hanging loosely from a single remaining hinge. Beyond it lay open ground bathed in pale moonlight, a wide stretch of overgrown lawn leading toward the dark tree line of the surrounding forest visible perhaps 200 yards distant. Rose hesitated only briefly before deciding that reaching the forest represented her best remaining hope, reasoning that the dense trees might offer better opportunities for concealment than the castle's confined and increasingly dangerous interior passages. She pushed through the rotted door and began limping as quickly as her injured ankle allowed across the open lawn, acutely aware of how exposed and vulnerable she remained in the moonlight, and had covered perhaps half the distance toward the tree line when a chilling, high-pitched howl rose from somewhere behind her, confirming that her pursuers had indeed emerged from the tunnel system and picked up her trail once again with terrifying speed. Rose pushed her injured body harder than she had ever pushed it before, ignoring the searing pain in her ankle as she sprinted the remaining distance toward the tree line, the howl behind her joined now by a second, equally chilling cry that suggested her pursuers had multiplied beyond the original two creatures that had cornered her in the courtyard. She reached the forest's edge and plunged immediately into the dense undergrowth, branches tearing at her exposed skin and clothing as she pushed deeper into the concealing darkness beneath the canopy. The forest floor proved treacherous and uneven, forcing her to slow her pace considerably despite the mounting urgency of her situation, every snapped twig and rustled leaf sending fresh jolts of terror through her already exhausted nervous system. She paused briefly behind the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree, straining to catch her breath while listening intently for any sound of pursuit, and heard, with sickening clarity, multiple sets of footfalls now moving through the forest behind her, no longer confined to the single werewolf that had originally given chase. She realized with dawning horror that word of her escape attempt had likely spread throughout the ballroom's assembled guests, transforming what had begun as a single predator's pursuit into something resembling an organized hunt involving multiple different creatures, each presumably eager to claim whatever prize her capture might represent within their strange, ancient traditions. Rose forced herself to continue moving despite her exhaustion and injury, weaving deliberately between trees in an attempt to break whatever trail her pursuers might be following, though she harbored increasingly little hope that such simple evasive tactics would prove sufficient against creatures whose senses so clearly exceeded anything within normal human capability. As Rose continued her desperate flight through the dense forest, she stumbled upon a narrow game trail that offered slightly easier footing than the surrounding undergrowth, and she followed it gratefully despite her lingering uncertainty about where it might ultimately lead. The trail wound between ancient, moss-covered trees, occasionally opening into small clearings bathed in pale moonlight before plunging once again into deeper shadow. She had traveled perhaps a quarter-mile along this path when a new sound reached her ears, distinct from the howls and crashing undergrowth of her pursuers, a soft, almost musical humming that seemed to emanate from somewhere just ahead of her current position. Rose slowed her pace cautiously, uncertain whether this new development represented potential rescue or an entirely new danger she had not yet encountered. She crept forward carefully and found, in a small clearing ahead, a figure that appeared entirely human, An elderly woman sitting calmly on a fallen log, humming softly to herself as though entirely unaware of the danger and chaos unfolding throughout the surrounding forest. Rose hesitated at the clearing's edge, torn between desperate hope that she had finally found genuine help and a growing, instinctive wariness born from everything she had already witnessed and survived throughout this horrifying night. The woman looked up suddenly, her humming ceasing abruptly, and fixed Rose with a gaze that, even across the clearing's moonlit distance, carried an unsettling quality entirely inconsistent with ordinary human warmth, and Rose felt every instinct in her exhausted body screaming that this encounter, however initially reassuring in appearance, represented yet another danger rather than the rescue she had so desperately hoped to find. The old woman smiled at Rose with an expression that seemed carefully calibrated to appear kind and grandmotherly, yet something about the smile's precise construction struck Rose as deeply unnatural, as though the expression had been studied and practiced rather than felt genuinely. She spoke softly, inviting Rose to rest beside her for a moment, claiming to have wandered from a nearby farmhouse and expressing gentle concern over Rose's obviously distressed and injured condition. Rose remained frozen at the clearing's edge, every survival instinct she possessed screaming warnings that this encounter represented danger rather than salvation, though she could not immediately articulate the specific source of her growing unease. The woman's form seemed to shimmer subtly at the edges as she spoke further, a barely perceptible distortion that reminded Rose uncomfortably of heat rising from summer pavement, and Rose suddenly recalled, with horrified clarity, fragments of old regional folklore Theo had once mentioned regarding shape-shifting creatures capable of assuming human or animal forms to lure unsuspecting victims closer. She backed away slowly from the clearing, refusing the woman's continued gentle invitations to rest and talk further, and the woman's carefully constructed expression of grandmotherly warmth flickered suddenly into something far more predatory, her features beginning to shift and elongate in ways that confirmed Rose's worst suspicions beyond any remaining doubt. Rose turned and fled back into the denser forest without waiting to witness the full extent of the creature's transformation, her heart pounding with renewed terror as she realized that even seemingly harmless encounters within this cursed forest could conceal deadly predators lurking just beneath a carefully maintained facade of harmless, reassuring humanity. Rose crashed through the underbrush in a blind panic, no longer following any deliberate path or strategy, driven entirely by the primal need to put maximum distance between herself and the shape-shifting creature she had narrowly avoided in the clearing behind her. Branches tore at her already torn clothing and exposed skin, but she barely registered the fresh scratches and abrasions accumulating across her arms and legs. Her entire consciousness narrowed down to the singular, desperate goal of continued survival. She eventually stumbled into another small clearing, this one dominated by the crumbling ruins of what appeared to be an old stone chapel, its roof long since collapsed, ivy and moss claiming much of its remaining walls as nature slowly reclaimed the abandoned structure. Rose paused here briefly, gasping for breath, and noticed with cautious relief that the sounds of pursuit had grown noticeably fainter, whether because she had genuinely gained distance on her hunters or because they had temporarily lost her trail amid the forest's confusing tangle of paths and undergrowth. She ducked into the chapel's ruined interior, seeking whatever temporary shelter its crumbling walls might provide, and found, to her surprise, a narrow stone stairway descending into what appeared to be some kind of crypt beneath the chapel's foundation. Exhausted, injured, and desperate for any form of respite, however brief, Rose descended the stairs cautiously, her hand trailing along the cold stone wall for support, hoping fervently that whatever lay below might offer a genuine opportunity to rest and formulate a more coherent survival strategy than the desperate, directionless flight that had carried her this far into the night's ongoing nightmare. The crypt beneath the ruined chapel proved small and mercifully empty, containing only a few ancient stone sarcophagi arranged along its perimeter walls, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of undisturbed time. Rose sank gratefully to the floor near the crypt's entrance, finally allowing herself a moment of genuine rest as she caught her breath and assessed the extent of her injuries in the dim moonlight filtering weakly down through the chapel's collapsed roof above. Her ankle had swollen considerably, throbbing with every heartbeat, and numerous scratches and abrasions covered her arms and legs, though thankfully nothing appeared severe enough to immediately threaten her continued ability to move if circumstances demanded it. She used the brief respite to think more carefully about her situation, recalling Madame Content's earlier mention that surviving until dawn would technically guarantee her safe passage away from the castle grounds, though she had no reliable way to estimate exactly how many hours remained before sunrise might finally arrive. She considered remaining hidden within the crypt for as long as possible, reasoning that stillness and concealment might ultimately prove more effective than continued desperate flight through unfamiliar and dangerous terrain. As she settled deeper into this strategy, however, a soft scraping sound from somewhere within the crypt's shadowed depths sent fresh alarm coursing through her exhausted body, and she realized, with dawning horror, that the ancient chamber she had chosen for shelter might not be as empty or as safe as its initial appearance had suggested, the darkness near the farthest sarcophagus seeming to shift and coalesce into a shape that had certainly not been visible when she first descended the narrow stone stairway moments earlier. Rose froze completely as the shape near the farthest sarcophagus continued its slow, deliberate movement, gradually resolving into the form of a pale, gaunt figure rising from what she now realized had been a resting position within the ancient stone container itself. The figure's skin possessed an unnatural, almost translucent quality in the dim moonlight, and as it turned toward her, Rose caught sight of elongated canine teeth pressing visibly against thin, bloodless lips, confirming with sickening certainty exactly what kind of creature she had unknowingly disturbed within its resting place. The vampire, for Rose could no longer deny that this was precisely what she was looking at, studied her with an expression of mild, almost bemused curiosity rather than immediate aggression, as though genuinely surprised to find an unexpected visitor intruding upon its ancient resting place in the middle of the night. Rose remained frozen near the crypt's entrance, calculating desperately whether she could reach the stairway and flee before the creature closed the distance between them, though her exhausted, injured body offered little confidence in her ability to outrun something that had clearly survived through centuries of far more capable pursuers than herself. The vampire took a slow, almost languid step forward, its movements carrying an unnerving grace entirely inconsistent with the ancient, decrepit appearance of its surroundings, and spoke in a low, cultured voice entirely unlike the guttural growls and predatory silence she had encountered from the other creatures pursuing her throughout the night, remarking with cold amusement that it had been quite some time since anyone had been foolish or desperate enough to seek shelter within its private, carefully guarded resting place. Rose's mind raced desperately for any possible response that might buy her precious time or somehow discourage the vampire's obvious predatory interest, though every survival strategy she had employed throughout the night suddenly felt woefully inadequate against a creature whose calm, cultured demeanor suggested centuries of practiced and successful hunting. She backed slowly toward the stairway, keeping her eyes fixed on the vampire's approaching form, and stammered out a desperate explanation regarding her situation, hoping against reasonable hope that some appeal to whatever remained of the creature's evident intelligence and apparent restraint might prove more effective than blind flight. The vampire paused at her words, tilting its head with the same unsettling curiosity it had displayed upon first noticing her presence, and remarked, almost thoughtfully, that the castle's ongoing hunt represented rather crude entertainment for what it clearly considered a far more refined predatory tradition than the frenzied chase currently being conducted by the estate's cruder guests. Rose seized upon this apparent distinction, asking desperately whether the vampire might be persuaded to let her pass unharmed given its evident disdain for the other creature's more savage approach to the evening's hunt. The vampire's expression shifted subtly, something calculating entering its otherwise composed features, and it replied that it might indeed be willing to consider such an arrangement, though it would require something in return for such an unusual act of mercy, an admission that filled Rose with a cautious, desperate hope even as some deeper instinct warned her that whatever price this ancient and clearly dangerous creature intended to demand would likely prove far steeper than she could currently afford to pay. The vampire explained, with unsettling calm, that it required only a small taste of her blood in exchange for safe passage from its crypt, assuring her that such a minor exchange would leave her weakened but very much alive and capable of continuing her desperate flight from the castle's other, less merciful hunters. Rose weighed this horrifying proposition against her rapidly diminishing alternatives, understanding that refusing outright would likely result in an outcome far worse than the limited exchange currently being offered. She reluctantly agreed, extending her arm with trembling reluctance as the vampire approached with predatory grace, its cold fingers wrapping gently but firmly around her wrist as it bent toward the offered limb. The bite itself proved shockingly painful, a sharp, burning sensation entirely unlike anything Rose had previously experienced, followed almost immediately by a strange, disorienting wave of weakness that spread rapidly through her exhausted body as the creature fed briefly but efficiently from the wound it had created. After what felt like an eternity but had likely lasted only a few seconds, the vampire released her wrist and stepped back, licking a small trace of blood from its thin lips with evident satisfaction, and gestured toward the crypt's stairway with an almost courtly gesture that struck Rose as grotesquely incongruous given everything that had just transpired between them. She stumbled toward the stairs on legs that felt disturbingly unsteady, the vampire's parting words following her as she ascended, a warning delivered in that same cultured, unsettling tone, that the castle's other guests would likely prove far less accommodating should they successfully corner her before dawn finally arrived to end the night's ongoing, horrifying hunt. Rose emerged from the crypt back into the ruined chapel above, her body weakened considerably from the blood the vampire had taken, her vision swimming slightly as she forced herself to continue moving despite the growing lightheadedness threatening to overwhelm her exhausted system. She stumbled through the chapel's collapsed doorway back into the surrounding forest, uncertain how much time remained before dawn but increasingly desperate to find some form of genuine shelter or assistance before her weakened condition made her an even easier target for whatever creatures continued their relentless pursuit throughout the night. She had traveled only a short distance when the sound of approaching footsteps, heavier and more numerous than any single pursuer, reached her ears from somewhere close behind, and she realized with sinking dread that her scent, weakened and marked now by the vampire's recent feeding, had apparently made her considerably easier to track through the dense forest terrain. She forced her exhausted, weakened body into a stumbling run, though her earlier speed and agility had been severely compromised by both her injured ankle and the blood loss she had just suffered within the ancient crypt. She had covered perhaps another 100 yards when a massive shape burst from the underbrush directly ahead of her path, the same werewolf creature that had originally initiated her desperate flight from the castle's ballroom, its golden eyes gleaming with predatory triumph as it recognized that its quarry had finally been cornered, weakened and exhausted, with seemingly nowhere left remaining for her to run. Rose skidded to a desperate halt as the werewolf advanced slowly toward her, clearly savoring the moment after such a lengthy and frustrating pursuit throughout the night, its powerful muscles coiled beneath matted fur as it prepared to close the final distance between predator and exhausted prey. She backed away instinctively, though her weakened, unsteady legs offered little confidence in her ability to outmaneuver the creature now that it had finally cornered her within the dense, unfamiliar forest terrain. Her eyes darted desperately around her immediate surroundings, searching for any possible avenue of escape or improvised defense, and settled upon a fallen tree branch lying nearby, thick and heavy enough to potentially serve as a crude weapon despite her rapidly diminishing confidence that such a simple tool could offer any meaningful protection against a creature of the werewolf's evident size and strength. She grabbed the branch regardless, raising it defensively as the creature continued its slow, deliberate advance, and shouted at it with whatever remaining courage and defiance she could summon from her exhausted, terrified body, refusing to simply surrender to what increasingly felt like an inevitable and horrifying fate. The werewolf paused briefly at her display of continued resistance, tilting its massive head with what almost resembled genuine curiosity, before letting out a low, rumbling growl that Rose interpreted, with a sinking feeling, as something closer to amusement than any genuine hesitation regarding its intended attack. It lunged forward suddenly with terrifying speed, and Rose swung her improvised weapon desperately, connecting solidly with the side of its skull in a blow that seemed to stagger the creature only momentarily before it recovered and renewed its attack with even greater ferocity than before. The werewolf's claws raked across Rose's shoulder as she attempted to dodge its renewed attack, tearing through fabric and flesh alike and sending a searing wave of pain through her already exhausted body. She stumbled backward, clutching her injured shoulder, blood seeping freely between her fingers as the creature circled her position with predatory patience, clearly confident that its cornered prey now possessed little remaining capacity for meaningful resistance. Rose's vision swam alarmingly, whether from blood loss, exhaustion, or some combination of both, and she felt her legs finally beginning to buckle beneath the accumulated weight of injury and terror that had defined nearly every moment of this seemingly endless, horrifying night. The werewolf lunged again, and this time Rose barely managed to twist aside, its powerful jaws snapping shut only inches from her throat, close enough that she felt the creature's hot, fetid breath against her already torn skin. She scrambled backward across the forest floor, her improvised weapon lost somewhere during the confused, desperate struggle, and found her back pressed suddenly against the rough bark of an ancient tree, leaving her with no further room to retreat from the creature's continued, relentless advance. The werewolf approached slowly now, seemingly savoring what it clearly perceived as the inevitable conclusion of its lengthy pursuit, and Rose, cornered and severely weakened, found herself searching desperately within her rapidly diminishing reserves of strength and resolve for any final option that might yet offer some slim chance of survival against a predator so thoroughly and completely superior to her own exhausted, injured, and increasingly desperate human capabilities. Just as the werewolf prepared to close the final, fatal distance between itself and its cornered prey, a sudden, piercing howl erupted from somewhere deeper within the surrounding forest, different in tone and quality from the creature's own earlier vocalizations, causing it to pause abruptly and turn its massive head toward the unexpected sound with visible confusion and irritation. Rose seized upon this unexpected distraction, scrambling desperately along the base of the tree trunk in a frantic attempt to create some distance from the momentarily distracted creature. The werewolf's attention remained divided for several crucial seconds, its head swiveling between its intended prey and the direction of the mysterious howl, before it finally let out its own answering growl and turned fully away from Rose to investigate the apparent intrusion into what it clearly considered its exclusive hunting territory. Rose did not waste the precious opportunity this unexpected reprieve had provided, pushing herself upright despite her severe injuries and exhaustion, and staggering as quickly as her weakened body allowed in the opposite direction from both the werewolf and whatever new threat had apparently drawn its attention away from her. She had no way of knowing whether this development represented genuine rescue or simply a different, equally dangerous complication within the castle's ongoing, horrifying hunt, but she recognized instinctively that questioning her sudden, unexpected reprieve would accomplish nothing beyond wasting the limited time it had granted her. She pushed onward through the dark forest, her injured shoulder throbbing violently with every movement, driven forward entirely by a desperate, primal will to survive just a little longer, praying fervently that dawn might finally be approaching somewhere beyond the seemingly endless canopy of trees stretching in every direction around her. Rose stumbled through the forest for what felt like an eternity, though she had no reliable way to measure the actual passage of time given her exhausted, injured, and increasingly disoriented state. She eventually emerged onto a narrow dirt road that wound its way through the trees, and she paused there briefly, torn between the desperate hope that this road might lead her toward genuine safety and the equally strong fear that following it might simply expose her more directly to whatever creatures continued their relentless pursuit throughout the surrounding wilderness. She chose to follow the road cautiously, staying close to the tree line where she could quickly duck back into concealment if any sign of pursuit reappeared, moving as quickly as her severely weakened condition allowed. After perhaps a quarter mile of cautious progress, she spotted a faint light flickering through the trees ahead, and her heart leaped with desperate, cautious hope that she might have finally stumbled upon some form of genuine human habitation or assistance. She approached carefully, her earlier encounter with the shape-shifting creature in the forest clearing still fresh enough in her memory to prevent any careless rush toward the source of the light. As she drew closer, she realized the light emanated from a small, isolated cabin set back from the road, its windows glowing warmly against the surrounding darkness, and though every instinct honed by her recent horrifying experiences urged extreme caution, the desperate need for any form of shelter or assistance before her severely weakened body finally gave out entirely left her with little practical alternative but to approach and hope, against everything she had already witnessed and survived, that this particular refuge might finally prove genuinely safe. Rose approached the cabin's front door with extreme caution, her injured body trembling from exhaustion, blood loss, and the accumulated terror of everything she had endured throughout the seemingly endless night. She knocked weakly, uncertain whether she possessed the strength to remain standing much longer regardless of whatever response her knock might receive. The door opened after a tense moment to reveal an elderly man, entirely ordinary in appearance, who took one look at Rose's battered, bloodied condition and immediately ushered her inside with genuine, evident concern rather than the calculated performance of kindness she had encountered from the shape-shifting creature earlier in the night. He introduced himself as Walter, explaining that he had lived alone in this isolated cabin for many years, tending a small property at the forest's edge, and expressed immediate alarm upon learning that Rose had apparently wandered from the direction of the old castle deeper within the woods. Rose, though desperately relieved to have finally found what appeared to be genuine, ordinary human assistance, remained cautiously guarded, having learned throughout this harrowing night that appearances could prove dangerously deceiving. Walter, apparently sensing her hesitation, explained gently that he had lived near these woods long enough to understand at least something of the castle's dark reputation among older local residents, and that he maintained certain precautions around his property specifically because of the rumors and occasional strange occurrences he had witnessed over the decades of his residence. He gestured toward several old iron horseshoes nailed above his windows and door frames, along with sprigs of some kind of dried herb hanging from the exposed ceiling beams, explaining that such traditional protections, whatever their actual scientific validity, had at least provided him with some measure of psychological comfort throughout his many years of isolated rural living so close to the castle's unsettling grounds. Walter helped Rose settle into a worn but comfortable chair near his modest fireplace, quickly retrieving basic medical supplies to begin cleaning and bandaging her various injuries while she recounted, in halting, exhausted fragments, the horrifying events of her evening at the castle. He listened with grave, attentive concern, occasionally nodding as though certain details confirmed suspicions he had long harbored regarding the true nature of the castle's infamous, secretive gatherings. Once he had finished tending her wounds as thoroughly as his limited supplies allowed, he expressed sincere concern that even his cabin, despite its traditional protective measures, might not offer sufficient safety should the castle's hunters successfully track her scent to his isolated property. He mentioned that his truck, parked in a small shed behind the cabin, could potentially carry her to the nearest town before dawn, though he cautioned that the access road leading away from his property remained narrow and treacherous, particularly when navigated during the darkest hours of night. Rose, despite her profound exhaustion, recognized the wisdom in Walter's suggestion, understanding that remaining stationary for too long, even within a location offering seemingly greater safety than the surrounding forest, still carried significant risk given everything she had already witnessed regarding her pursuer's evident tracking abilities. She agreed gratefully to his offer, and Walter moved quickly to prepare for their departure, gathering a few additional supplies and a shotgun from a locked cabinet near his bed, explaining with grim practicality that while he doubted such a conventional weapon would prove genuinely effective against creatures of the sort Rose had described, he preferred having some form of tangible defense available rather than relying entirely on traditional protective symbols and desperate hope alone. As Walter finished his preparations, a sudden, violent crash against the cabin's exterior wall sent both of them flinching in startled alarm, followed immediately by a low, guttural growl that confirmed Rose's worst fears regarding how quickly her pursuers had managed to track her scent to this supposedly safer refuge. Walter grabbed his shotgun immediately, positioning himself protectively near the cabin's single door while urging Rose toward a small back window that offered a potential secondary escape route should the situation deteriorate further. Another heavy impact struck the cabin's wall, this time accompanied by the distinct sound of splintering wood, and Rose realized with sinking dread that whatever creature had located them clearly possessed sufficient strength to eventually breach even Walter's carefully reinforced dwelling regardless of the traditional protective symbols adorning its windows and door frames. Walter fired a warning shot through the cabin's front door as a third impact rattled the entire structure violently, though the gesture accomplished little beyond confirming that conventional firearms offered minimal deterrent against the relentless, supernatural strength of their pursuer. Rose scrambled toward the back window as Walter had instructed, working frantically to force it open despite her injured, exhausted condition, while behind her the cabin's front door finally gave way entirely beneath a final, devastating impact, revealing the massive form of the werewolf creature standing triumphantly within the shattered doorway, its golden eyes fixed with predatory satisfaction upon the two humans who had dared attempt to shelter from its relentless, unforgiving pursuit. Throughout this long and increasingly desperate night, Walter fired again as the werewolf lunged into the cabin's interior, this shot striking the creature's shoulder and eliciting a pained snarl that at least confirmed conventional ammunition capable of causing some genuine, if limited, injury despite its clearly supernatural resilience. Rose finally managed to force the back window open and scrambled through it just as she heard Walter's desperate shout behind her, followed immediately by the sickening sound of the werewolf's claws finding their mark against something considerably softer than the cabin's wooden walls. She landed hard on the ground outside, pain shooting through her already injured ankle and shoulder, but she forced herself upright immediately, understanding with horrified certainty that Walter had likely just sacrificed himself to buy her the precious few seconds she desperately needed to escape. She sprinted toward the small shed Walter had mentioned earlier, praying fervently that his truck might offer her the means of escape he had originally intended before the werewolf's sudden, violent arrival had disrupted their careful plans entirely. She reached the shed and wrenched open its door, relief flooding through her exhausted body at the sight of an old but apparently functional pickup truck parked within, its keys, remarkably, still resting in the ignition exactly where Walter had presumably left them during his last use of the vehicle. Rose climbed into the driver's seat with trembling, blood-slicked hands, turning the key desperately as the sounds of violent struggle continued echoing from within the cabin behind her, the engine sputtering twice before finally roaring to life, granting her what she desperately hoped might prove her first genuine opportunity for escape since this horrifying nightmare had first begun many terrifying hours earlier. Rose threw the truck into gear and pressed the accelerator down as far as her trembling foot allowed, the vehicle lurching forward out of the shed and onto the narrow dirt road leading away from Walter's isolated cabin property. She risked a single glance in the rearview mirror and saw the massive shape of the werewolf emerging from the cabin's shattered doorway, its fur matted with blood that Rose desperately hoped belonged entirely to the creature itself rather than to the kind, elderly man who had so generously offered her shelter and assistance during her most desperate hour of need. The creature gave chase briefly, its powerful legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed despite the truck's rapidly accelerating pace, but gradually fell behind as Rose pushed the aging vehicle to its mechanical limits along the winding, treacherous forest road. She drove in a state of shocked, exhausted numbness for several minutes, her mind refusing to fully process the horror of what had just occurred within Walter's cabin, focusing instead entirely on the immediate, practical necessity of navigating the truck safely along the dark, unfamiliar road stretching ahead of her. The forest gradually began to thin as she continued driving, and eventually the narrow dirt road merged onto a wider, paved highway that Rose recognized, with cautious, disbelieving relief, as the same road she had originally traveled hours earlier during her initial drive toward the castle at the start of this catastrophic evening. She continued driving without any clear destination in mind beyond the desperate, singular need to put maximum distance between herself and everything she had witnessed and survived throughout the preceding hours of unimaginable horror. As the eastern horizon finally began showing the first faint hints of approaching dawn, gray light gradually replacing the absolute darkness that had defined nearly every terrifying moment of Rose's ordeal, she allowed herself a small, cautious measure of hope that she might genuinely be approaching the end of this nightmare at last. She continued driving along the highway, her body running almost entirely on adrenaline and desperate willpower given how severely her physical reserves had been depleted throughout the night's relentless series of chases and confrontations. She eventually spotted the lights of a small gas station ahead, one of the first signs of ordinary civilization she had encountered since fleeing the castle's grounds many hours earlier, and she pulled Walter's truck into its lot with hands still shaking uncontrollably from exhaustion and lingering terror. The station's night attendant, a young man who looked barely out of his teenage years, stared at her with obvious alarm as she stumbled through the entrance, her clothing torn and bloodied, her injuries visible despite Walter's earlier attempts at basic first aid. She managed to explain, in halting, exhausted fragments, that she needed help, that she had been attacked and required immediate medical attention and police assistance, carefully omitting the more fantastical details of her ordeal that she suspected would result in disbelief or, worse, involuntary psychiatric commitment rather than the practical help she currently required. The attendant, to his credit, responded quickly and professionally, immediately calling for emergency services while providing her with a chair and whatever basic supplies his station's small first aid kit contained, and Rose finally allowed herself to sink into the chair, her body trembling with the delayed shock of everything she had somehow managed to survive throughout the longest and most horrifying night of her entire life. The ambulance and police arrived within 20 minutes, and Rose found herself swept into the practical, reassuring routine of emergency medical treatment, paramedics carefully examining and treating her various injuries while a patient but clearly skeptical police officer attempted to gather details regarding what had actually happened to her throughout the night. Rose provided a carefully edited account, describing an assault by an unknown assailant during her drive home from a catering job, deliberately omitting any mention of the castle, its monstrous guests, or the supernatural creatures that had pursued her relentlessly throughout the preceding hours. She knew, with grim practical certainty, that any attempt to describe the true events of her evening would result in immediate disbelief and likely psychiatric evaluation rather than the genuine police investigation and protection she desperately hoped to secure. The officer noted her account carefully, though his expression suggested obvious doubt regarding certain details that did not quite align with her otherwise carefully constructed explanation, particularly the unusual, animal-like nature of some of her injuries that the attending paramedics had noted with visible professional confusion during their examination. Rose deflected these questions as best she could, attributing the unusual wound patterns to her desperate flight through dense, unfamiliar forest terrain, and eventually the officer seemed satisfied enough to conclude his initial interview, promising that a more thorough investigation would follow once she had received proper medical treatment and adequate rest. As the ambulance finally began transporting her toward the nearest hospital, Rose stared out the vehicle's rear windows at the gradually lightening sky, understanding with a complex, exhausted mixture of relief and lingering horror that she had somehow, against all reasonable odds, survived to see this dawn arrive. Rose spent 3 days recovering in the hospital, her physical injuries treated thoroughly while doctors expressed considerable professional confusion regarding certain aspects of her wounds that did not align neatly with any conventional explanation for animal attack or human assault. She maintained her carefully constructed story throughout numerous follow-up interviews with both medical staff and increasingly persistent police investigators, understanding that any deviation from her original account would likely undermine whatever credibility she had managed to establish regarding the assault she claimed to have survived. During a rare quiet moment alone in her hospital room, she found herself thinking constantly of Walter, wondering whether any trace of his sacrifice had been discovered by authorities investigating the isolated cabin property, and feeling a profound, aching guilt regarding the fate he had almost certainly suffered on her behalf during those final, desperate moments before her escape. She also thought frequently of Theo and the other catering staff who had remained within the castle throughout that horrifying night, wondering with growing dread whether any of them had managed to survive the evening's terrible events, or whether they had simply become additional, unreported victims of whatever ancient, monstrous tradition the castle's secretive gatherings apparently represented. She considered, during these long, contemplative hours of hospital recovery, whether she possessed any genuine obligation or practical ability to warn others regarding the castle's true nature, though every rational assessment of her situation suggested that such warnings would likely result only in her own institutionalization rather than any meaningful prevention of future tragedies befalling other unsuspecting temporary workers hired through the same seemingly innocuous staffing agency that had originally connected her to this nightmarish employment opportunity. Upon her release from the hospital, Rose returned briefly to her small apartment, finding it strange and disorienting to re-enter the ordinary rhythms of her previous life after everything she had experienced during that single, catastrophic night. She contacted the staffing agency that had originally arranged her castle assignment, intending to demand answers regarding exactly what kind of employment they had knowingly or unknowingly sent her into, but found that the agency's phone number had been disconnected entirely, and subsequent research revealed no trace of the company's previous registration or business licensing that she could locate through any conventional means. This discovery left her with an unsettling, unresolved sense that whatever forces had orchestrated her horrifying evening at the castle possessed resources and influence considerably beyond what any ordinary criminal investigation might realistically hope to uncover or address. She attempted, through careful and cautious research, to locate any information regarding Theo or the other temporary staff members who had worked alongside her that night, but found no trace of their existence beyond the vague, second-hand memories she retained from their brief, shared conversations during those final hours before the horror had truly begun. She eventually located a brief, unremarkable news item mentioning an elderly local resident named Walter who had apparently died under circumstances the article described only as an unfortunate accidental fire at his rural cabin property, a description that offered Rose a small, bitter measure of closure regarding his fate while confirming her worst fears about the price he had paid for his selfless assistance during her desperate flight from the castle's monstrous pursuers. Rose struggled significantly in the weeks following her ordeal, finding herself unable to fully return to her previous life or routine given everything she now understood regarding the genuine, monstrous dangers that apparently lurked within seemingly ordinary rural landscapes throughout the surrounding region. She experienced recurring nightmares featuring the werewolf's golden eyes, the vampire's cold, cultured voice, and the rake's unnaturally elongated form dropping silently from the courtyard wall, each vivid dream leaving her drenched in sweat and unable to return to sleep for the remainder of the night. She sought professional psychological counseling, though she found herself forced to maintain the same carefully edited version of events she had originally provided to police and medical staff, understanding that revealing the true, supernatural nature of her experiences would likely result in a diagnosis and treatment approach entirely unsuited to the genuine trauma she actually needed to process and eventually overcome. Despite these significant challenges, she gradually began rebuilding some semblance of ordinary routine, though she found herself avoiding rural areas and isolated locations with an intensity that occasionally strained her relationships with friends and family who could not fully understand the source of her sudden, dramatic shift in comfort regarding previously unremarkable activities like hiking or countryside drives. She occasionally researched local folklore and historical records regarding castles and estates within the region, searching for any additional information that might help her understand exactly what she had encountered, though most of her research yielded only vague, unreliable local legends that offered little concrete insight into the genuine, horrifying reality she had personally witnessed and barely survived during that single catastrophic night many weeks earlier. Nearly 2 months after her ordeal, Rose received an unexpected and deeply unsettling piece of mail, a plain envelope with no return address, containing only a single photograph depicting the castle's grand ballroom exactly as she remembered it from that horrifying night, along with a handwritten note bearing no signature, simply stating that her survival had been noted and that such an outcome occurred rarely enough to warrant particular attention from certain interested parties. Rose stared at the note for a long time, her hands trembling with a fear she had hoped might gradually fade with sufficient time and distance from the original events, but which this unexpected communication had reignited with devastating, immediate intensity. She considered contacting the police regarding this apparent threat, but recognized immediately that doing so would require revealing details about her original ordeal that she had so carefully avoided disclosing throughout the entire investigation process. Details that would likely undermine her credibility entirely while providing no meaningful protection against whatever genuine threat this mysterious note actually represented. She instead began taking additional precautions in her daily life, installing stronger locks on her apartment doors and windows, researching various traditional protective measures similar to those Walter had maintained around his own ill-fated cabin property, and remaining constantly, exhaustingly vigilant regarding her surroundings whenever she found herself in unfamiliar or isolated locations. The photograph and note remained a constant, unwelcome reminder that her survival, however hard-won and genuinely miraculous given everything she had endured, had apparently not gone entirely unnoticed by whatever ancient, powerful forces continued operating behind the castle's secretive, monstrous gatherings, leaving her with the deeply unsettling understanding that this particular chapter of her life might never truly reach a complete and final resolution. Rose spent considerable time in the following weeks attempting to determine whether the mysterious note represented a genuine ongoing threat or simply an isolated, unsettling communication intended to remind her of her continued vulnerability without necessarily indicating any immediate, active danger. She reached out cautiously to a few individuals within online communities dedicated to discussing local folklore and unexplained phenomena, carefully framing her inquiries in ways designed to avoid revealing too much personal detail while still gathering whatever additional information she could regarding castles or estates with reputations similar to the one she had personally experienced. Through this careful, methodical research, she eventually connected with a small, private network of individuals who claimed, with varying degrees of credibility, to possess first-hand knowledge or family histories connected to similar supernatural encounters throughout the region's long and often violent history. One particular contact, an elderly woman who identified herself only by the pseudonym Agatha, proved unexpectedly forthcoming regarding the castle's apparent reputation among certain long-time local residents, explaining that similar gatherings had reportedly occurred at the property for many generations, always followed by the mysterious disappearance of temporary workers hired specifically for the events, though official investigations into these disappearances had apparently always concluded without any definitive findings or meaningful accountability. Agatha warned Rose that her survival, while certainly remarkable, likely marked her permanently as someone of particular interest to whatever forces controlled the castle's ongoing, secretive operations, and cautioned her to remain perpetually vigilant regarding her personal safety, advice that Rose found simultaneously reassuring in its validation of her own instinctive fears and deeply unsettling in its implicit confirmation that her ordeal might never truly reach a complete, final conclusion. Rose continued her cautious correspondence with Agatha over the following weeks, gradually piecing together a more complete, if still fragmentary, understanding of the castle's long, dark history and its apparent role as a gathering place for various supernatural entities throughout many generations of ongoing, secretive operation. Agatha explained that the castle's current arrangement, involving hired human staff who occasionally survived to tell their stories, represented a relatively recent adaptation of what had originally been a far more brutal and comprehensive tradition, suggesting that some degree of external pressure or oversight, however limited or ineffective, had gradually forced the castle's monstrous guests to adopt at least a nominal pretense of allowing occasional survivors amid their otherwise horrifying, predatory gatherings. This information provided Rose with a strange, complicated sense of perspective regarding her own ordeal, understanding that her survival, while certainly attributable in significant part to her own resourcefulness and Madame Content and Walter's crucial assistance, also existed within some broader, ancient framework of rules and traditions that she still understood only in fragmentary, incomplete detail. She asked Agatha directly whether any organized effort existed to permanently address or eliminate the castle's ongoing threat to the surrounding region's unsuspecting population. Agatha's response proved sobering, explaining that previous attempts by various individuals and small organizations to directly confront or expose the castle's operations had historically ended in failure, disappearance, or, in several documented cases, sudden and inexplicable death, suggesting that whatever forces protected the castle's secretive gatherings possessed resources and influence considerably beyond what any small, independent group of concerned individuals could realistically hope to overcome through direct confrontation or conventional legal and investigative channels. Faced with this sobering assessment regarding the practical impossibility of any direct confrontation with the castle's ongoing operations, Rose gradually shifted her focus toward simply ensuring her own continued survival and personal safety rather than pursuing any broader campaign to expose or eliminate the threat entirely. She maintained her careful precautions, continued her cautious but valuable correspondence with Agatha and the small network of similarly informed individuals, and slowly began rebuilding a version of her ordinary life that incorporated her hard-won knowledge without allowing that knowledge to completely consume or define her continued existence. She occasionally received additional unsettling reminders of her lingering connection to the castle's ongoing operations, further anonymous notes or unexplained incidents that suggested continued, distant surveillance of her activities, though none escalated into the kind of direct, immediate threat that had defined her original horrifying night at the estate. She found some measure of peace in Agatha's continued reassurance that survivors who avoided actively provoking or exposing the castle's operations generally faced relatively limited ongoing risk, though the qualifier embedded within that reassurance, the acknowledgement that some risk inevitably remained regardless of her own careful behavior, ensured that Rose never fully abandoned the heightened vigilance she had developed throughout her recovery. She eventually changed careers entirely, moving away from catering and temporary staffing work altogether in favor of a more stable, predictable position that offered considerably less risk of ever again encountering an employment opportunity remotely similar to the catastrophic assignment that had so thoroughly and permanently altered the entire trajectory of her previously ordinary life. Nearly a year after her original ordeal, Rose finally worked up sufficient courage to return, cautiously and from a considerable safe distance, to the general vicinity of the castle's remote location, driven by a complicated mixture of lingering curiosity and a genuine, if still incomplete, need for some form of closure regarding the events that had so dramatically reshaped her life and understanding of the world's genuine hidden dangers. She parked along the same winding mountain road she had originally traveled that fateful night, though she made no attempt to approach the castle grounds directly, understanding all too well the genuine dangers such an approach would represent given everything she had since learned regarding the property's ongoing, secretive operations. From her safe vantage point along the distant roadside, she could just make out the castle's distinctive silhouette rising above the surrounding tree line, appearing, in the ordinary light of a clear afternoon, deceptively peaceful and unremarkable, entirely unlike the horrifying, monstrous gathering place she knew it genuinely represented beneath its deceptively serene exterior appearance. She remained there for only a short while, taking in the sight with a complicated blend of lingering fear, hard-won resilience, and quiet, personal acknowledgement of everything she had somehow managed to survive against odds that had seemed, throughout that original horrifying night, utterly insurmountable. She eventually returned to her car and drove away, understanding with clear, unflinching acceptance that the castle and its monstrous inhabitants would likely continue their ancient, secretive operations regardless of her own personal survival or subsequent understanding of their existence, a sobering but ultimately manageable reality she had gradually learned to carry alongside the rest of her ordinary, carefully rebuilt life. In the years that followed, Rose built a quiet, deliberately unremarkable life far removed from the catering and temporary staffing industry that had once nearly cost her everything, finding steady employment and gradually reconstructing meaningful relationships with friends and family who never learned the true, horrifying details of what she had actually experienced during that single catastrophic night many years earlier. She maintained occasional, cautious contact with Agatha and the small network of similarly informed individuals, continuing to gather whatever fragmentary information occasionally surfaced regarding the castle's ongoing operations, though she never again attempted any direct investigation or confrontation that might draw unwanted attention back toward her own carefully rebuilt existence. She thought often of Walter's selfless sacrifice, and occasionally of Madame Content's small, quiet act of rebellion against the castle's otherwise merciless traditions, understanding that her own survival owed a profound debt to both individuals regardless of how their own personal fates had ultimately unfolded. She never fully escaped the occasional nightmare or sudden, inexplicable moment of heightened anxiety triggered by unexpected reminders of that horrifying night, the golden gleam of a dog's eyes catching streetlight at an unusual angle, the sight of an elegant stranger's unnaturally sharp smile, or simply the isolated quiet of an unfamiliar rural road traveled after dark. Yet she also carried forward a hard-won, quietly resilient understanding that she had faced something few people could ever imagine surviving, and had ultimately endured through a combination of her own resourcefulness, unexpected allies, and simple, stubborn refusal to surrender when every reasonable expectation suggested she should have already perished many times over throughout that impossibly long and horrifying night at the Blackthorn Ball. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you in the next one.